The moment almost nobody talks about happens when you are completely alone. Not in church, not during a debate, not while surrounded by people who believe the same things you believe. It happens at 2 in the morning when the room is dark, your mind is exhausted, and a thought appears that you immediately try to push away. What if I am more afraid of being wrong than I am interested in knowing the truth? Most people do not feel threatened by that question because they assume they already know the answer. But stay with it for a moment. Imagine someone who has spent years defending a belief, praying, reading, learning, sharing, trusting, sacrificing, hoping. Imagine that person suddenly realizing that the greatest threat to any conviction is not criticism from the outside. It is the possibility that certain questions have never been allowed inside. That realization creates a strange tension, because if a belief is true, questions should not destroy it. And if questions can destroy it, then perhaps the belief was depending on something other than truth to survive. This is where many people become uncomfortable, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack sincerity, but because human beings do not merely believe ideas, they build identities around them. They create friendships around them, families around them, memories around them, entire versions of themselves around them. And once a belief becomes part of your identity, questioning it no longer feels like examining an idea. It feels like threatening your own existence. Think about how often people say they are searching for truth. It sounds noble, it sounds courageous, but are most people truly searching for truth? Or are they searching for reassurance? There is a difference, a painful difference. Truth does not promise comfort. Truth does not promise certainty. Truth does not promise emotional security. Reassurance does. Reassurance tells you that everything is fine. Reassurance tells you that your current understanding is already correct. Reassurance removes tension. Truth often creates it. And that leads to an uncomfortable possibility. Sometimes what we call faith may contain a mixture of genuine conviction and emotional protection. Sometimes the thing being defended is not only a belief about reality, sometimes it is also protection from uncertainty, loss, mortality, loneliness, or meaninglessness. That does not automatically make the belief false, but it raises a question many people spend their entire lives avoiding. How much of what I believe comes from evidence, experience, reflection, and conviction? And how much comes from fear of what happens if I stop believing? Notice how quickly the mind reacts to a question like that. Some people immediately become defensive, others become anxious. Others try to dismiss it before examining it. That reaction itself is interesting, because the strongest reactions often reveal the places where we feel the most vulnerable. Imagine a person standing at the edge of a cliff. The fear they feel does not necessarily mean there is danger behind them. It means there is danger where they are looking. In the same way, emotional resistance does not prove a question is wrong. Sometimes it suggests the question has touched something important. Think back to childhood. Not your beliefs specifically. Think about certainty itself. There was a time when adults seemed to know everything. Teachers knew everything. Parents knew everything. Authority felt solid, stable, permanent. Then life happened. You grew older. You discovered adults were confused too. You discovered experts disagree. You discovered intelligent people can reach opposite conclusions. You discovered certainty is often more fragile than it appears. Yet many people still crave the emotional safety they felt when someone else seemed to have all the answers. If this question has ever crossed your mind, even once, leave a comment and share when it happened. Not because there is one correct answer, but because many people quietly wrestle with these thoughts and assume they are alone. They are not. The reason this matters is because doubt is often misunderstood. Many people see doubt as the enemy of faith. But is it? Think about that carefully. A belief that has never encountered doubt has never really been tested. It has only been protected. Imagine 2 bridges. One bridge has survived storms, floods, pressure, and years of use. The other has never carried any weight at all. Which bridge would you trust? The same question can be asked about conviction. Is a faith that has survived honest questioning weaker than one that avoids it, or stronger? There is a reason this conversation creates tension. Deep down, Many people know there are questions they have never fully allowed themselves to ask. Not because the questions are impossible, because the consequences feel dangerous. What if the answer changes everything? What if the answer changes nothing? What if I discover I have misunderstood something important? What if I discover I was right all along? The strange thing is that fear exists on both sides. People sometimes imagine only believers fear being wrong. That is not true. Skeptics fear being wrong too. Atheists fear being wrong. Agnostics fear being wrong. Philosophers fear being wrong. Everyone fears being wrong because being wrong threatens the story we tell ourselves about reality. Human beings are not merely attached to beliefs, they are attached to coherence. They need a story that makes sense of existence. Remove the story and anxiety rushes in to fill the space. That is why debates often accomplish so little. Most debates are not searches for understanding. They are competitions between identities. One person is trying to defend their story, another person is trying to defend theirs. Meanwhile, the deeper question remains untouched. Why do human beings need certainty so desperately in the first place? Imagine someone experiencing profound suffering, a loss they cannot explain, a tragedy they cannot understand, a pain that arrives without warning and refuses to leave. In moments like that, certainty can feel like oxygen. The mind searches desperately for explanations because explanations create a sense of control. Even if the explanation is incomplete, it feels better than chaos. This is not weakness, it is part of being human. The problem appears when our need for certainty becomes stronger than our willingness to examine what is true. Then questioning feels dangerous. Then curiosity feels threatening. Then exploration feels like betrayal. And that is where something fascinating happens. The very thing that was supposed to make a belief stronger begins making it weaker. Because beliefs protected from examination become fragile. They become dependent on silence. They become dependent on avoidance. They become dependent on never encountering the wrong question at the wrong time. But reality does not cooperate with that strategy. Life asks questions whether we are prepared or not. Suffering asks questions. Death asks questions. Injustice asks questions. Loneliness asks questions. Love asks questions. Regret asks questions. Every human life eventually arrives at moments that force deeper reflection. And in those moments, inherited answers sometimes feel less satisfying than they once did. Not because they are necessarily wrong, because life has become more complicated. Think about a person who once believed everything was simple. Good people are rewarded. Bad people are punished. Hard work guarantees success. Justice always prevails. Then reality interrupts. Good people suffer. Bad people prosper. Effort sometimes fails. Life becomes messy. The person is faced with a choice. Ignore reality to protect certainty, or allow certainty to become more complicated. The second option is far more painful, but it is often where growth begins. Here is the uncomfortable possibility that many people spend years avoiding. What if the goal is not certainty? What if the goal is honesty? Those are not the same thing. Certainty says I know. Honesty says this is what I currently understand. Certainty ends the conversation. Honesty keeps it open. Certainty feels powerful. Honesty often feels vulnerable. Yet honesty may be the thing that allows a person to keep growing long after certainty would have stopped them. Somewhere in the back of your mind, there may be a question you have never fully explored. A question you immediately distract yourself from whenever it appears. A question that makes you uncomfortable because it touches something deeper than logic. It touches identity, meaning, fear, hope. That question is probably more important than you realize, because the questions we avoid often reveal the truths we need most, not necessarily the answers, the truths about ourselves, why we believe, why we fear, why we cling, why we resist, why we search. And perhaps that is where this entire journey begins, not with proving anything, not with winning an argument, not with defeating a worldview, but with a far more difficult challenge, looking directly at the places where certainty feels most threatened and asking whether what survives that examination becomes weaker or stronger. Because there is something coming next that makes this tension even harder to ignore. A realization that has changed the way countless people think about faith, doubt, conviction, and truth itself. And once you see it, it becomes very difficult to unsee. There is a reason certain questions follow people for years. They appear during long drives when there is no music playing. They appear during funerals when everyone is trying to say the right thing, but nobody can explain why suffering feels so random. They appear during moments of success when you finally achieve something you spent years chasing and discover the satisfaction disappears much faster than expected. They appear when you watch someone lose everything, despite doing everything right. And they appear when you realize that life keeps presenting contradictions that refuse to fit neatly into the stories we prefer. What makes these questions so powerful is not that they are impossible to answer. It is that they force us to confront something most human beings spend enormous energy trying to avoid: the possibility that certainty is not the same thing as understanding. Think about how often people confuse familiarity with truth. A belief repeated thousands of times begins to feel self-evident. An idea heard since childhood begins to feel obvious. A conclusion accepted by everyone around us begins to feel unquestionable. Yet history is full of examples where entire cultures confidently accepted things that later turned out to be incomplete, mistaken, or deeply misunderstood. This is not an argument against any particular belief system. It is an observation about human psychology. Familiarity creates an illusion of certainty. Repetition creates an illusion of inevitability. Community creates an illusion of consensus. None of those things automatically make an idea true or false. They simply make it feel safer, and safety is often far more persuasive than evidence. Imagine two people standing in the same storm. One sees evidence that the universe is meaningless. The other sees evidence that there must be meaning hidden somewhere beyond immediate understanding. Both are looking at the same reality. Both are experiencing the same pain. Yet they arrive at completely different conclusions. Why? That question matters more than most people realize, because it suggests that human beings are not passive observers of reality. We interpret reality, we filter it, we construct narratives around it, we search for patterns, we assign meaning, we connect experiences into stories that help us navigate existence. The problem is that once a story becomes emotionally important, challenging it begins to feel personal. This is where many discussions about faith become trapped. One side assumes doubt is weakness. The other side assumes belief is weakness. Both may be missing something important. What if belief and doubt are not opposites? What if they are partners? Think about it carefully. Courage only exists because fear exists. Patience only exists because frustration exists. Forgiveness only exists because hurt exists. In the same way, perhaps meaningful faith only exists because doubt exists. A faith that has never encountered uncertainty may not be faith at all. It may simply be confidence. And confidence is easy when nothing challenges it. The real test comes when life stops cooperating with expectations. Consider a moment many people secretly experience but rarely discuss openly. Someone prays for a specific outcome. They pray sincerely, they hope intensely, they believe completely. Then the outcome never arrives. What happens next reveals something profound about human nature. Some people abandon their belief immediately. Others hold on to it even more tightly. Others enter a long period of confusion where they are unsure what to think. Yet beneath all three reactions lies the same emotional struggle. The struggle between expectation and reality. The struggle between what we hoped would happen and what actually happened. The struggle between the world we imagined and the world we inhabit. That struggle exists far beyond religion. It appears in relationships, careers, dreams, friendships, goals. We constantly create expectations about how life should unfold. Then reality reminds us that it follows its own rules. The deeper question is not whether disappointment exists. It clearly does. The deeper question is what disappointment reveals about us. Does it expose weaknesses in our understanding? Does it reveal hidden assumptions? Does it uncover fears we did not know we carried? Sometimes disappointment functions like a mirror, not because it tells us everything about reality, but because it tells us something about ourselves. And this is where many people encounter a realization they never expected. They discover that the thing they are defending most aggressively is not always their belief. Sometimes it is their need for certainty. There is a difference. A person can sincerely pursue truth even while questioning deeply held assumptions. But a person obsessed with certainty often cannot, because certainty demands protection, it demands control, it demands guarantees. Truth offers none of those things. Truth often arrives wrapped in ambiguity. Think about the biggest questions human beings have ever asked. Why are we here? What happens after death? Is there ultimate meaning? Is consciousness more than biology? Is morality objective or created? Why does suffering exist? These questions have occupied philosophers, theologians, scientists, skeptics, and ordinary people for thousands of years. Yet despite centuries of discussion, complete agreement remains impossible. Some people find that frustrating, others find it fascinating, because perhaps the persistence of these questions tells us something important. Perhaps certain mysteries are not difficult because humans are unintelligent. Perhaps they are difficult because reality itself is extraordinarily complex, and complexity creates humility, or at least it should. Unfortunately, humility is often treated as weakness. Many people feel pressured to project certainty, even when they are uncertain. They fear that admitting doubt will make them look confused. They fear that acknowledging questions will make them appear weak. Yet some of the most thoughtful people who have ever lived spent their lives admitting how much they did not know. The more they learned, the more aware they became of the vastness of what remained unknown. If you have ever wrestled with uncertainty, leave a comment describing the question that has stayed with you the longest. Not the question you can answer easily, the one that still follows you, the one that keeps returning no matter how many times you try to move on from it. What makes these questions powerful is that they often reveal a hidden conflict between the heart and the mind. The mind wants consistency. The heart wants meaning. The mind wants evidence. The heart wants hope. The mind wants answers. The heart wants peace. Neither side is wrong. Both are part of being human. But tension emerges when they appear to demand different things. Imagine someone standing beside the hospital bed of a loved one. Logic alone feels insufficient. Emotion alone feels insufficient. In moments like that, people often discover that reality cannot be reduced to simple formulas. Human experience is richer, stranger, and more complicated than any single framework can fully capture. This realization creates another uncomfortable possibility. What if many of our arguments are attempts to escape uncertainty rather than understand reality? Think about how people often debate. They search for weaknesses in opposing views. They prepare responses before listening. They defend positions as though their survival depends on it. Rarely do they stop and ask themselves a more difficult question. What evidence would actually change my mind? That question is terrifying because it forces honesty. If the answer is nothing, then the search for truth may have already ended. If the answer is something, then humility becomes necessary. Humility requires accepting that our current understanding could be incomplete, not necessarily wrong, incomplete. And incompleteness is uncomfortable because it leaves room for mystery. Human beings generally dislike mystery. We prefer conclusions, we prefer closure, we prefer certainty. Yet life repeatedly refuses to provide those things. The future remains uncertain, relationships remain unpredictable, mortality remains unavoidable. Existence itself remains filled with unanswered questions. Perhaps that is why so many people spend their lives chasing certainty. It feels like protection against chaos. But what if certainty is not the strongest foundation? What if honesty is? A person who builds their worldview entirely on certainty becomes vulnerable whenever uncertainty appears. A person who builds their worldview on honest exploration can continue growing even when difficult questions emerge. This distinction becomes especially important when discussing faith, because if faith depends on never encountering difficult questions, then every challenge becomes a threat. But if faith can coexist with questions, uncertainty, and intellectual struggle, then challenges may become opportunities rather than dangers. Notice that none of this proves anything. That is precisely the point. The goal is not to force conclusions. The goal is to examine assumptions. The goal is to explore whether certain fears are protecting us from reality or protecting reality from us. And that brings us closer to the realization many people spend years avoiding. The greatest threat to a belief is not a difficult question. The greatest threat is the fear of asking it. Because once fear controls inquiry, exploration stops. Growth stops. Reflection stops. The mind begins defending conclusions instead of investigating them. And when that happens, it becomes almost impossible to distinguish conviction from comfort. Yet there is still a deeper layer beneath all of this, a layer that has less to do with arguments and more to do with identity. Because the most difficult questions are rarely intellectual, they are personal. They touch childhood memories, family relationships, emotional wounds, experiences of loss, moments of hope, private fears, hidden desires. They touch the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why our lives matter. And once that layer is exposed, the conversation changes completely. Because the next realization is not about faith alone. It is about the human need for meaning itself. And that realization has the potential to challenge both belief and disbelief in ways most people never expect. Imagine sitting across from a version of yourself that cannot lie. Not a wiser version, not a more successful version, just a completely honest version. Every excuse removed, every performance removed, every carefully constructed explanation removed. And imagine that version asks a question so simple that it feels almost unfair. If you knew with absolute certainty that nobody would judge you, nobody would reject you, nobody would be disappointed in you, and nobody would ever find out, what would you admit you are truly afraid of? For many people, the answer has very little to do with religion, philosophy, or intellectual arguments. The answer is much deeper. Some would admit they are afraid that life has no ultimate meaning. Others would admit they are afraid that it does. Some are terrified that they will die and disappear. Others are terrified that they will be remembered for nothing. Some fear being wrong. Others fear never knowing whether they were right. And this is where the entire conversation takes a surprising turn, because beneath countless debates about faith, doubt, belief, skepticism, evidence and certainty lies a shared human experience that almost everyone recognizes, but few people fully confront. The experience of existing without complete answers. Think about how strange it is. Human beings are capable of building civilizations, exploring space, decoding genetics, creating art, developing technology, and transforming entire continents. Yet every person who has ever lived eventually arrives at the same mystery. They wake up one day and realize they are here, conscious, aware, experiencing reality, experiencing love, fear, hope, loss, wonder, and pain. And no matter how much knowledge accumulates, certain questions remain. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does consciousness exist at all? Why do beauty, morality, sacrifice, and meaning feel so significant to the human experience? These questions are not merely intellectual. They are deeply personal because they shape how people live. The fascinating thing is that most people assume certainty would solve their struggles. They imagine that if every mystery disappeared tomorrow, peace would finally arrive. But would it? Think about your own life. Have your greatest struggles always come from lacking information? Or have many come from knowing exactly what you should do and still struggling to do it? Human beings often suffer not because they lack answers, but because reality refuses to align perfectly with those answers. A person may believe in love and still experience heartbreak. A person may believe in justice and still witness injustice. A person may believe in purpose and still feel lost. Knowledge alone does not remove existential tension. In some cases, it intensifies it. This is why the conversation about faith becomes far more interesting when it moves beyond arguments and enters the territory of human psychology. Because people rarely adopt beliefs for purely intellectual reasons. Experiences shape them. Relationships shape them. Trauma shapes them. Gratitude shapes them. Loss shapes them. Moments of awe shape them. Moments of despair shape them. Two people can read the same information and reach entirely different conclusions because they are interpreting it through different lives. One person sees suffering and concludes existence is indifferent. Another sees suffering and concludes meaning must be found despite it. One sees beauty and concludes there is something greater beyond human understanding. Another sees beauty and concludes it emerges naturally from existence itself. Neither person is merely processing facts. They are processing life, and life is never experienced from a neutral position. That realization should create humility, not because all conclusions are equally valid, but because every human being is limited. Every human being sees through a particular lens. Every human being carries biases, assumptions, emotional needs, hopes, fears, and blind spots. The uncomfortable truth is that nobody escapes this condition. Not believers, not skeptics, not philosophers, not scientists, not spiritual seekers, not atheists, not religious leaders. Everyone is navigating reality from a limited perspective. Yet something remarkable happens when a person truly accepts that limitation. Instead of becoming weaker, they often become stronger because they stop pretending certainty they do not possess. They stop treating questions as enemies. They stop seeing curiosity as betrayal. They become more interested in understanding than winning, more interested in honesty than appearances, more interested in reality than comfort. This may be the realization many people spend years moving toward. A faith that cannot survive examination is fragile. But the same is true of disbelief. The same is true of ideology. The same is true of any worldview. Anything that depends on avoiding difficult questions becomes vulnerable the moment those questions appear. And life has a way of asking difficult questions eventually. It asks them through grief, through failure, through unexpected joy, through love, through aging, through death, through the simple passage of time. Every person eventually encounters experiences that challenge the stories they once believed about themselves and the world. Some respond by clinging more tightly to certainty. Others respond by abandoning certainty altogether. But perhaps there is another path, a path that involves courage rather than certainty. Because courage does not require knowing everything. Courage requires facing what you do not know. Think about the moments in your life that changed you most. Were they moments of certainty, or were they moments when certainty collapsed and something deeper emerged? The end of a relationship, the loss of a loved one, a major disappointment, a profound realization, a moment of unexpected grace. Many of the experiences that shape people most deeply begin with confusion rather than clarity. They begin with questions rather than answers. They begin with uncertainty rather than confidence. Yet those moments often become turning points because they force a person to confront reality honestly. And honesty is far more transformative than certainty. Here is the possibility that many people never consider. What if the value of faith is not that it eliminates every question? What if its value is revealed in how it responds to questions? What if the same principle applies to skepticism? What if maturity is not measured by how many answers a person possesses, but by how honestly they engage with uncertainty? Suddenly, the conversation changes. It is no longer about protecting an identity. It is no longer about winning an argument. It becomes a deeper exploration of what it means to be human. Because every human being lives between knowledge and mystery. Every human being stands between certainty and doubt. Every human being searches for meaning while confronting uncertainty. The details differ, but the experience is universal. If you disagree with any part of this, explain why in the comments. Not because disagreement is a problem, but because honest disagreement often reveals assumptions that would otherwise remain hidden. Some of the most valuable insights emerge when people challenge each other respectfully and thoughtfully. And perhaps that is the final tension hidden inside the question that started this journey. If your faith is real, it should survive this. But maybe the word "this" never referred to a specific argument, criticism, contradiction, or challenge. Maybe this refers to honesty itself. Maybe this refers to the willingness to examine what you believe, why you believe it, what fears influence it, what experiences shaped it, and what questions still remain unanswered. Because if a conviction cannot survive honesty, it was already weaker than it appeared. And if it can survive honesty, then honesty was never the threat. The real threat was fear. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of questions. Fear of complexity. fear of discovering something unexpected. Yet fear has never been a reliable guide to truth. Fear tells us to avoid. Curiosity tells us to explore. Fear tells us to defend. Honesty tells us to examine. Fear tells us to stay where we are. Growth asks us to move forward. The irony is that many people spend their lives searching for certainty when what they truly need is courage. Courage to ask. Courage to listen. Courage to reflect. Courage to admit what they know and what they do not know. Courage to remain open without becoming lost. Courage to remain grounded without becoming closed. Because in the end, the most important question may not be whether you possess perfect certainty. It may be whether you are willing to face reality as honestly as possible, wherever that journey leads. And that is a challenge that reaches far beyond faith. It reaches into every belief, every assumption, every fear, every hope, and every story we tell ourselves about who we are. The people most transformed by that challenge are rarely the ones who think they have all the answers. They are usually the ones who had the courage to keep searching even when the answers were not guaranteed. And perhaps that search, more than certainty itself, is what reveals the deepest truths about the human condition.